And I have the pleasure to introduce Matias, or Matias Olsen, I apologize for pronunciation, who's a Senior Manager of Public Affairs and Policy at EUCOPE, who's going to be speaking to us about EU HTA and how to navigate the new procedures. So, Matias?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. If not, you can come closer. There's plenty of free seats. And since we're quite let's say, low number of people in here, I mean, feel free to ask questions throughout this session, so we can keep it a bit interactive if you have any questions. And if not, we'll try to make some time for them towards the end. So what I want to talk to you today is really to take you through what the procedure of the EU HTA looks like. So we're going to be talking about the Joint Scientific Consultations and the Joint Clinical Assessments. But I will also be here tomorrow together with my friend and colleague, Herbert Altmann from Syncora, and we'll be chairing one of the tables at the World Cafe session that is running tomorrow from 11 a.m. So if you have any questions or want to have more of an in-depth conversation, feel free to swing by our table, and we would appreciate any questions that you have. So the number one question is probably in the mind of a lot of companies right now is, are my products, is my pipeline actually subject to joint clinical assessment? And I think a lot of people are already familiar with the rolling start of the JCA, which means that from this year already, oncology products and cell and gene therapies, or ATMPs, are subject to JCA. Then this will be expanded on the 13th of January 2028 to orphan medicinal products. So currently, if you have a cancer drug that's also an orphan medicinal product, it is subject to JCA. But if it is purely an orphan medicinal product, non-cell and gene and non-oncology products, then that will only be subject to JCA in 2028. And in 2030, this will be expanded to all centrally authorized products. Now, that's easy to remember. However, when it comes to your specific product, you really need to be careful, and you need to do a bit of a due diligence check here for each product in your pipeline, because for oncology products, there's the criteria that it contains a new chemical, biological, or radiopharmaceutical active substance. So new active substance, and this is based on what the company reports when you file to the EMA, when you let's say, signal your intention to file to the EMA. And even if the EMA later finds that there's no new active substance, then the JCA will still have started. So that's the trigger. And then for OMPs and cell and gene therapies, there's no such trigger. Then another question is, okay, we already have a product on the market. Is that product now going to be subject to JCA because we're looking into a new indication? Well, in most cases, when an authorized product with a JCA report is published, then if there's a new indication for that, it will be subject to a JCA. But if not, it will go via the national procedures. So that means that these procedures will be running in parallel for some time. So you still need to think about the national procedures and JCA, at least for the next couple of years. So what are the actual conditions? Well, just recently, last month, the European Commission published an FAQ document which states which products are subject to JCA. So I would ask you to really keenly read through this document, because it really answers a lot of the questions that we have been receiving over the past couple of months from some of our members. For example, where are the products listed that are subject to JCA? So it's in the regulation establishing the EMA, so Annex 1. With all of the products that are subject to a centralized procedure, new active substances at the time, that it is submitted in accordance with the Article 8.3 of Directive 2001, so it's considered a full application, and that is submitted after relevant dates set forth. So you can find this guidance document, so probably you wouldn't be able to memorize it, but you can find it on the European Commission website, and there's also the guidance of the HTA coordination group. A lot of guidance has been published, so I would really recommend that you go and familiarize yourself with it, both for the joint clinical assessment, the procedure, what is the procedural guidance, explaining what's laid out in the implementing act, which I think is quite complex, reading through all of the articles. The HTA coordination group has put these guidance documents together for you. So let's look at the Joint Scientific Consultations. This is something that is quite important to our member companies. They're small to mid-sized and are maybe looking to familiarize themselves with the procedures or maybe test some of their assumptions. Of course, this is not something completely new. I think a lot of you are familiar with the GBA scientific advice through national procedures or in France, or the EMA scientific advice. This is really the continuation of that. The scientific advice has been granted at the national level. Key difference is that this is going to be a joint advice from all of the HTA bodies, so 27 member states plus Norway. So this, of course, you will receive an outcome document that outlines the scientific recommendation. It has to be started before you start your phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials, of course, to actually receive some input that can change your planned studies. And it's very important that this advice is non-binding. So although you have to explain in your dossier any deviation from the advice that you received during JSC, it's non-binding. And you can also receive this joint scientific consultation. So it's joint in the sense that it's all of the HTA bodies together. You can also receive it in parallel with the EMA scientific advice, and then it's called parallel JSC. So this year, there have been 2 request periods. So again, if you're familiar with the national scientific advice procedures, you're probably used to loading up the website, and you can see all of the different slots throughout the year. Not so for this one, because the slots are quite limited. So you need to anticipate and be aware of the request periods. And then you need to see if that actually lines up with your clinical development plans. So in 2025, we're through 2 request periods. That will be increased. Next year, there will be 3. And whereas this year there were 7 slots for JSC, next year there will be, we don't know yet, but there will be more, hopefully a lot more. Important to note as well, if you are not able to get a JSC, if you apply for one and you turn down, you can still apply for another one, although most likely the timelines won't end up. But you do have that opportunity. And the JSC overall takes 4.5 months. Some of them have already started. I think the last slot that is given for this first 7 JSCs is taking place beginning of next year. So all of those slots are, of course, already filled. In order to be eligible, so as I said, of course, your studies have to be in the planning stage. And then your product has to be likely to be subject to a JCA, so it means you're going to file within that rolling period of implementation. So if it's an ATMP, an oncology product, or an orphan medicinal product, then most likely that qualifies. And then there are a number of selection criteria. They're all explained in these guidance documents, so you can go and read there to understand it a bit better. Although some of these might be not that intuitive to understand. So how does major union-wide added value differentiate from potential impact on patients, public health, or healthcare systems? Kind of sounds like the same. So you have to, of course, be a bit inventive in how you answer to these, but there is a bit of guidance provided, although no one really quite understands how these are fully applied yet. It's very early in the process. Where do you reach out? I'm sure you will receive these slides afterwards, but there's the email, so you actually communicate throughout this directly with the European Commission, so you don't communicate with the HTA bodies or the coordination group. You'll be communicating with the so-called HTA Secretariat, which is the European Commission, and their email is there. Then, of course, you receive, you have to send in a briefing package, as you know from National Scientific Advice. You can also, you can also ask about post-launch evidence generation. And you can also ask about HOR, so cost-effectiveness studies, if you want. And then that advice that you will be receiving will, of course, be from those HTA bodies that actually perform this. So it might be from a limited number or subset of countries. A big question is, of course, so if you receive this advice, a lot of times there might be some differences in views between the different HTA bodies. And this will also be represented in this outcome document. If there are, it's a bit like dissenting opinions on a court, you will be receiving those differing opinions as well from some HTA bodies. So if you, we hear this a lot when we talk to the Joint Scientific Consultations subgroup. They say that they get a lot of repeat questions, and really simple questions are easier, straightforward, to really keep them, let's say, very specific, not very open. So the more specific the questions are, the better the answer that you get is likely going to be. Now it has changed. It's not a physical meeting that you get at the JSC. It's a virtual meeting. It lasts for 3 hours. You can participate up with 12 participants. I'll just stop here very quickly, see if there's any questions to the Joint Scientific Consultations. I would recommend to really take this opportunity. Yes, Herbert?
Thanks. Very nice summary of the JSC procedure. There is something surprising to explain the deviation from a recommendation in the clinical trial designs. How could we envision this looks like? I mean, what kind of arguments would you say here as a pharma company?
That's a very good question. So I think this has happened as well. I think even if you follow the advice, so let's say even if you take the advice to use some certain registry data, for example, then it's not necessarily guaranteed to lead to a better outcome in the JCA. So it could still lead to a conclusion that is high uncertainty, right? And I think even in this case, if you are let's say trying to explain why you have not opted for this advice, I would certainly try to spend some time explaining it. So within the dossier itself, if you've seen the template, I mean, it's quite sort of, it says you should write this here, this there. But I understand that you can, of course, provide some additional context, etc., throughout the dossier, if you wish to. And this. It's a bit of a challenge because the JCA, there's of course no conclusions in the JCA. It's just let's say an assessment of the certainty of the evidence without any conclusions. But that of course means that it's quite, let's say, limited what you can communicate through that. But you can provide some additional context throughout your dossier as well.
Matias,
yes.
When it
Please.
comes to the consultation, and how much is then coordinated with the regulatory EMA when it comes to providing input on endpoints and suggesting changes on endpoint, and even outside of EMA, like because the company FDA is probably the most important.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. Now, you would want it to be considered, but it's not. So it's clearly seen as separate procedures, right? So even if you have it together, they will issue their independent advice independent from each other. So it will not necessarily be aligned with each other. So you could get diverging advice.
That's right. It shouldn't be aligned, but they are requested. EMA's requested to. They get the HTA-CG answers. They read the documents separately, and they are asked to consolidate where possible. So that is exactly right. That is not completely, they're not requested, but they're requested to see where they can consolidate and should. It's a bit, do you know the parallel advice, the old parallel advice? Yeah. It's actually the same guidance.
Thank you very much. Let's keep it interactive throughout. Looking at the time, so joint clinical assessments. it's very important to note. I was in a meeting last week with it's a regulatory conference, so speaking to your counterparts, and there we had Michael Bankin from the EMA, and he said so far, I mean, it's quite a low number of companies that are actually following this key step, which is to send when you send the EMA letter of intent, you also have to notify the HTA Secretariat of your intent to submit marketing authorization, because it's very important, because that's when everything kicks off. That's when you receive also confirmation with the timelines, etc., for the JCA. So this is very important. Also, everything is to be submitted via the IT platform, which means in order to access this, you need your user account. And it's only after following this step that you actually get this. Now, this is a very busy slide, but I want to stay on this a bit because this is really the whole process. So, of course, it follows the EMA timeline. So that's in gray and pink at the top. And then there are some key touch points throughout. So as you see on the far left of the slide here, really 6 to 7 months before you send when you send your EMA notification, you also notify the HTA coordination group, and then at some point you will also be asked to submit the summary of product characteristics and the clinical overview section of the marketing authorization application, which the member states will then take in order to develop sort of like a base case PICO, and then they will ask all of the member states to provide input on this through the what they call a PICO survey. And basically, every member state will be able to send their wish list of comparators, and there is no differentiation necessarily between off-label or on-label, although it's encouraged that these follow from European treatment guidelines and national treatment guidelines. And then there will be some sort of amalgamation of PICOs, so including the population, intervention, the comparators that they would like to see in the assessment. And then this is handed over to companies about latest around 90 days after the start of the JCA, or latest day 120 plus 10. At this point, companies can ask for a scope explanation meeting. So it's not a scoping meeting, it's a scope explanation meeting. You will have the opportunity to ask some questions, some clarifications, etc., about these PICOs. And this is really the first time that you hear what the comparators are for your assessment. And then the clock starts 100 days, and then you have to submit your dossier. Latest timeline is 45 days before CHMP opinion. It's really the very latest, can be before as well. Depends, again, on the regulatory timeline, so that will be confirmed at the start of the JCA. Now, you probably see a bit of a problem here, because you only get to know the comparators quite late, when the JCA has already started. And there's also not a lot of opportunities to interact throughout the procedure. So there is that scope explanation meeting, which you can ask for. Every company can ask for this, and I would recommend that you do so. You can actually tick a box when you send your first notification 7 months before the start of the procedure that you already want this. It's an online virtual meeting, 1 hour. And then companies are asked to do a factual accuracy check and to flag any information that is considered confidential. This is happening when the draft report has already been developed and reviewed. So there's quite few opportunities of interaction throughout. However, whereas companies are not really that involved in the procedure, clinicians and patients are involved as experts, and this is quite new. I mean, it's been tried and done in a few national systems, but it's really the first time that it's done systematically at the EU level. And so, whereas companies don't really give a lot of substantial input on the scope for the assessment and the comparators, patients and clinicians do. They provide input on the draft scope. They might also be involved by the member states when they are providing their wish list for comparators to the EU level. And again, patients and clinicians provide comments on the draft report. So substantial comments, whereas companies just do the factual accuracy check. So that's quite important to keep in mind, is that there is that expert input throughout the procedure. And I did say, there's no rule without exception. So there's an exception. So companies can be invited to provide input on the scope when that is still being drafted by the member states. However, it's up to the member states, the so-called JCA subgroup it's called, to actually invite companies to do so. So it's not guaranteed. So I'm going to skip through all of this, basically what I said. So maybe before we go into that, is there any questions about the JCA procedure slides? Yes, please.
One question. So I'm from Switzerland. We are
Yes.
not having the same regulatory process as you.
Mhm.
We have our separate
Yes.
Swiss made. And in Switzerland, the timelines, it's not always like that's the timeline.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's earlier, but it can also be later. So how hard are these deadlines? And what happens if you don't, for example, also submission deadline latest 45
Mhm.
days before CHMP opinion? So you can't know. What happens if you miss this deadline?
It's a very good point and very good question. So there is some flexibility built into the system, although 45 days before CHMP opinion, that's really the last date. Probably your deadline will be a bit before that. You can get some additional time if the regulatory timeline, for example, is running longer than expected. Then you can ask for an extension. So this is possible. Also, if the scope changes, for example, if the indication changes, then that might have to actually lead to changes in the scope as well, and the included populations within the PICO. And in that case, you will have some additional time. You can go back and update the dossier and do that again. So there are some flexibilities built into the system. Now, on the contrary, if you have an accelerated approval procedure with EMA, the timeline will be shorter. So you will not have 100 days. You will have 60 days to prepare the dossier. So everything is done a bit constricted. Very good. Good question. So just want to run you through a few of, let's say, recommendations from our side to really prepare for this. And number one, it shouldn't surprise you, is really to put the right people in the know. I mean, you really need to work closely together with your regulatory colleagues. As you see, the timelines are overlapping here. You're going to be squeezed on time, whereas previously you have done the EMA filing, and then you do your market access. You can go to Germany, France, Spain, and in the staggered approach, you have to do everything at the same time now. And that, of course, is going to be difficult. So you need to make sure you have the right procedures for handling that. And also, the national market access teams are going to be remain quite important, because you need someone to actually understand the national systems as well, and to get an understanding for what comparators you're going to see in the JCA. Like I mentioned, we really need to start early to identify which products are in scope. We would say 2 to 3 years early. On the oncology treatment criteria, I think it was a bit of a surprise where we saw Zolgensma again subject to a JCA. So it's that question of whether it was a full submission or not. So you really need to be careful here too, because this is really early in the start of the procedure, and this is still being defined. What is the clear scope of the procedure? So if you're in doubt, please check. Then, of course, you really need to plan for each process step. You saw it's a very short timeline, so you need to really make sure how can you actually maximize those small opportunities that you have to talk to the assessors. How do you actually maximize the scope explanation meeting? How can you use that? It's FaceTime with the assessors. They're going to look at your dossier. How are you going to prepare for the factual accuracy check where you have to respond within 7 days, calendar days? So you really need to prepare for this. How do you make full use of the expert involvement? Well, you need to understand how they're involved, who is going to be involved, and this is really something that needs to start early. You need to have a clear strategy, of course, for identifying the right comparators. I think everyone who's been around a bit knows it involves, of course, some sort of PICO simulation to identify the most relevant PICOs that you're likely to encounter. But it also involves going out and talking to people who actually know the system, talking to people who have worked within some of those authorities. So someone that knows HAS, someone that knows GBS, someone that really knows how they will see your chosen comparators and try to argue for those as well. And of course, there's no harm in already maybe going out and speaking to some of the key HTA bodies using national scientific advice as well. We didn't really talk about this, but the study designs of course, very important. Understand the methodology. How are certain things going to be seen at the EU level? Surrogate endpoints, for example, just to name one. This is really key, of course, to understand and really develop the right strategy for how to fill in that dossier. And I want to end on this. Expert involvement, I mentioned it very briefly, but it's really important to understand how they're going to be involved. There are new conflict of interest rules. They're not necessarily aligned with the EMA rules, so the policy 44. You really need to understand how are these going to be selected? Who is selecting them? What expert is going to be involved? Is my regulatory colleague already talking and engaging to someone, so now they cannot be involved in the JCA? Are there any exceptions to these rules? Yes, there are some exceptions. So you really need to understand all of the intricacies of this and to be prepared. I stop here because I'm over time already. We have time for a final question or two, maybe. Yes.
Countries decide on something that is not in a clinical trial, which is maybe not even in the secondary endpoint. What's your perception that because will identify the outcome of the product when they are doing it to reimbursement?
Well, so I think this is exactly what the member states want, right? They want to identify a lot of comparators that are not going to be in the clinical trial. We heard the reason for this is, and I skipped over, it's like they want this policy-driven PICO, so they want to really, and I have to say, there is a bit of difference probably within the coordination group as well, between the member states, but there is a recognition, as at least if you hear the chair of the coordination group, Niklas Hedberg, speak about it, he says, well, we want to really identify where those gaps, so where is it that we don't have evidence, or where is it that all the comparators are used, etc. But you have to answer all of the PICOs. That's what it says. You have to answer all of the PICOs. Then there's, of course, a completeness check as well that the European Commission is doing. And the very least you have to do is you have to explain why you couldn't answer a PICO. So maybe it's a literature review and showcasing that there's no existing evidence or data there. Now, if you want to try to answer the PICO, it's going to be an indirect treatment comparison, some sort of anchored network analysis. And of course, that it's probably going to increase the uncertainty as well of the findings, so it's not necessarily going to be seen favorably. And the comparators also you need to, of course, think about, is this a comparator that you really want to answer in the JCA, or is that maybe something that is better dealt with at the national level? So you have to, of course, you cannot deal with all of that when the report is first, when the PICOs is first presented to you. You really need to be aware of those ahead of time. But yeah, I think it's going to be a bit of a trade-off between, do you answer this now? Do you not? But they're definitely going to be there. I think we've heard, there's been 30 PICOs or something so far for some of the products, and this has been then reduced down to, I think I even heard 50 from Regina last week from EUCOPE. Upwards of 50 PICOs, and this was reduced down to less than 10 or something. So they are getting a lot of different comparator requests. It's the speaker table. They're the most active.
What about upcoming for rare diseases, off-label treatments that are not approved? Will that be in scope or?
Yeah. So, we had this discussion within our membership because we have a lot of companies developing orphan medicinal products, and when some countries tend to include off-label comparators for economic reasons, so it's cost containment, and of course that's not to the benefit of patients, not following the science, and so in this case, of course, you want to avoid it. But it's a very good point for rare diseases. A lot of times this might be the only comparator you have, and you might actually want to use that in your study as well. And in these cases, it will be possible. So you can use off-label, you can use on-label. There's really no differentiating. So that's sort of, let's say, cuts both ways, because yes, it's good that you can include off-label comparators, but there's no there's nothing barring countries for including them for cost containment reasons. Herbert, please.
Maybe only to complete that, we have some experience from the Joint Action 3 where one of the drugs, bevacizumab, was assessed and bevacizumab, Avastin, was used as an off-label comparator, which was not, of course, on the agenda of the Company Directives, which I was coming from. And from there on, I think it was very clear that all off-label comparators can be subject to the joint clinical assessment. For every reason. I mean, there were other products which were registered and reimbursed in this area of but they still took an off-label comparator. Everything was legally approved.
And during this period, I think the guidelines were even a bit more restrictive on using off-label comparators, where they were preferring authorized products as comparators. But whereas now it simply states it can be off-label or not, be on-label. Yes.
Also on that one, so remember that they are doing their assessments of sales and service to the countries. So the figures you get will come from the countries. And it's depending on the country if they are directing their reimbursement to only approved products or also to off-label products. It's more or less decided on the country level.
Challenging. Final question, comment? All right, then I'll applaud you. Thank you very much for being active.